It was early evening when I heard the knock on the door. I made sure to look through the peephole before I opened the door, of course. Still had my apprehensions about this entire thing. I had my hand on my pistol even as I opened the door. She surprised me when she smiled, that sexy little smile, and then walked up and began to kiss me. I will admit it was a bit uncomfortable at first, mainly because I lost my balance a little and knocked my spine into the wall behind me. She kept going until I pushed away. Looking confused, she tried to pull me back down until she noticed the 45 caliber in my hand. I assured her that she was safe, but I wasn't going to hurt her. Besides, if I wanted her dead, she wouldn't have made it in the house. After putting the pistol away, we talked for a while I made dinner. A couple of steaks with 3 different sides makes for a hearty meal. It was easy since I could just pull most of the vegetables out of the garden. I asked about where she comes from and how she became a succubus. As it turns out, she was born one. All of them are born to mothers that decide to have relations instead of just ingesting what they needed. As it turns out, she has 7 sisters and no brothers. As I said before, a male succubus is very rare. She has been alive for about 70 years. That one actually threw me back a bit as I tried to wrap my brain around this. As it turns out, succubus don't exactly age, at least not after a certain point. As long as they get what they need or ingest a lot of calories, then their bodies are simply in a constant state of regeneration and rejuvenation. It is the same for most of the creatures around the world. Yes, I said around the world. As it turns out, most of the old folklore about certain cryptids is true. This went far beyond my understanding of the subject, clearly. Never was one for the supernatural stuff, but it seems I was going to get a crash course. She told me about the fox ladies in the east, the yetis in Siberia, the snake people over in India, even the dogmen of the U.S. I spent most of the evening with my jaw open as she just talked about how she visited a few of their tribes, or packs if you will, when she was young. As it turns out, succubus have a caste-based system based primarily on age, though this was far from the only factors. The factors are, as far as I can remember her saying, are in the following order: age, number of children, number of slaves, yep, they make many of the men slaves, financial standings, usually this dictates the number of slaves, bloodline, and of course, sex. In case anyone is wondering, the reason sex is so low is because it actually puts you lower on the hierarchy. Most male succubus are relegated to either breeding or to make full-blood succubus, or as a tool for political gain. Just for laughs, I commented, "Wonder what would happen if they got a hermaphrodite," and got a hell of a shock. As it turns out, the only time that ever happened, the child was taken by a more demonic group. They're a small group of demons that claim to be succubus, but are not what you would think. Every single one of them has horns and a tail, and which is far more animal-like in appearance. The major factor is that their entire group is hermaphroditic and took the child because, even in monsters, incest clans lead to nasty consequences. So, of course, no mating between siblings. There was almost a war between the 2 races because of this, though the child stopped it by willingly leaving. Apparently, the kid threatened to kill itself to keep for so many, tearing itself to pieces, which makes sense. I remember saying, "Serious stones on that kid." I think, wait, maybe, was that right? She laughed at my inability to get the situation phrased just right. It was strange that we didn't even notice how late it was until the candles had burned down so far that the light was distracting our eyes. I looked at my watch and it was past midnight. She looked at me and said, "Well, I've been rambling on for so long, I guess there's room for dessert now." I looked at her as she continued, "Do you have something sweet?" I thought for a moment and responded, "Your dessert might be a little salty, not something you would like, though I know what you want to eat." I wasn't fooling her for a second as I stood up, and so did she. She took a step towards me, and I kneeled down. Thankfully, she was wearing a dress. I made sure that she was not able to stand in one spot before I wrapped my arms around and picked her up. I placed her on the sofa and continued. As I made her reach her third, maybe fourth orgasm, I noticed something. My tongue seemed longer. At least it seemed that way. I couldn't put too much thought into it due to the fact that not much blood was being pushed into my brain. In fact, it was going very far away. Without warning, she pulled like hell on my head, and I thought this time she was going to rip it off as she made me work my way north. Nope. She pushed me back down hard, and I landed on my back. With that much force, I would have figured that it would hurt more, or at all, really. She jumped on me like a horny, amphetamine-soaked circus monkey, destroying most of my clothes in the process. Thankfully, jeans aren't that easy to rip. While she went low and proceeded to attack her dessert with ferocity, I reached over and grabbed her leg. I spun her over and continued my quest to deaden the nerves in my tongue. It didn't take long after that before we were both reaching our limits. With a manic burst, we both exploded and were left panting on the living room floor. As I caught my breath, I looked, and she had gotten to the point in which she revealed her true form. Not to worry, it wasn't even slowing down. I will say I didn't truly notice until I heard, "What the hell?" I turned my head, and sure enough, you could have used me as a sundial. She smiled and started again. Though I wasn't going to stay on the hard floor, that is. Didn't have any carpet. I picked her up where she was and proceeded to walk into the kitchen for a bottle, or 4, of water. I figured we were going to need it. The entire time I was thinking she must be on autopilot because she didn't even slow down. I also found myself wishing I had set up a camera while thanking God no one could see me walking around with this inverted woman in my arms. We got to the bedroom and I almost had to throw her off to get her on the bed, at least for even a minute. Though as soon as she turned around and looked at me, something just snapped. I dropped the bottles and just dove at her. For the next hour or so, there was almost no stopping. Not sure if we could get in every position, but I'm sure we got pretty close. Somehow, we even got footprints on the ceiling. Can't quite remember how that one happened, but I do remember almost breaking the alarm clock when I accidentally kicked it off the nightstand. As this was going on, she bit me again, several times. At the time, I wasn't sure if it was out of excitement or she was just trying to get me to slow down. I was just moving like a man possessed after all. In the middle of it, I felt the same strange feeling as before. Her tail and wings had finally fully revealed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to see if there was another layer to this transformation. So I continued with even more ferocity. Guess I should have remembered what happened to the cat when it got curious. As I was finally getting close to when I felt something happening to her again, she seemed to get larger, and her body seemed to contort in ways I didn't think possible. Her tail seemed to get larger along with her wings. I know the tail for sure because at first it was trying to wrap around my waist, but it could barely get long enough and definitely not strong enough, being so thin. Now, there was far more girth in it, and it fully wrapped around my torso. Though, let's face it, I wasn't really paying attention to that. As I finally reached the end, she must have figured it out because she was holding me so tightly. I had a difficult time moving after that. Then something came over me and I bit down hard into her, right between her shoulder and her neck. Blood seemed to pour as my teeth sunk into her and my head began to clear a little bit, though it was far too late to stop what was coming next. I felt a surge through me like a workout high, wrapped in desire, filled with rage and passion, all mixed in with pure electricity. It was the point of no return, as it seemed like she shrinked a little in my arms. I was going so hard I could feel the supports in my bed frame beginning to give. As I hit the mountaintop, I pulled my head back and kissed her as all the buildup blasted from my body, and I could feel her simultaneously reach across the mountaintop with a burst that drenched us both. I rolled to the side, completely spent and gasping for air. I was looking at my date and was finally able to think clearly about who, or should I say what, was just in my arms. She did look a little larger than before, and built out more too. Her entire body dimensions had adjusted. She wasn't just thin anymore. In fact, she was shaped like one of the best models I'd ever seen. Hell, better than most of the CGI renderings I've ever seen. I wanted to just sit there and look at her, but fate had another idea. Pain in my abdomen was so sudden and so strong, I thought I had shattered my liver. It was clear it was actual hunger pains. Pain so bad I couldn't move, but I found myself running to the fridge at a full sprint. Without thinking, I started to pull out all the food I had purchased the day before. Good thing I had a full fridge because I wasn't going to stay that way for long. Soda, snacks, leftovers, hell, even raw meat was fair game. Speaking of which, it wasn't until I grabbed the uncooked chicken that I realized something. My hands weren't my hands anymore. They looked bigger, but also almost claw-ish. I looked at my body, and my arms seemed to be bigger too. My torso made me almost shudder, since it was like I was down around to 3% body fat or even less. This made my legs look even more muscular. My body hair had gone. It had fallen off as well, and this is where I started freaking out. I looked down to see I had gained some size where the women want it, but I reached around and also felt that I had a tail. A full-on tail! I started screaming, cursing into the air as I thrashed around the kitchen, and then ran into the bedroom to look into the mirror, and from there I lost my balance from what was looking back at me. I had grown another 8 more inches taller. Good thing I ducked through the door. My eyes had changed from their normal gray to an almost red color. My skin was surprisingly clear with no blemishes, scars, or birthmarks. So, not all bad news. My muscle mass seemed to have increased a lot as well. Guess that was the reason why I was so hungry. Despite the muscle mass, I was still surprisingly thin for someone my size. On top of my head seemed to be horns similar to ram horns, but not as pronounced, really. It's difficult to explain, but they were back like ram horns, but they didn't roll to the side. They just stopped right around where a bald spot, if I had a bald spot, would start. I turned around and looked to see what the hell was growing out of my spine. Sure enough, that tail was right there. I once again got lightheaded and had to hold onto the wall to keep from ending up on the floor. I also looked on my back, and there were 2 large lumps that seemed to be. This time I fell forward and used a sink to hold up. Less than a minute later, I heard a voice from down the hall. "What's the matter?" is what I heard from a voice fighting a mouthful of food. She entered the doorway as I turned to her. Both stare at each other for a few moments. I can't speak because I'm in shock, and she doesn't speak because of another mouthful of food. After a few moments comes, "What the fuck?" from both of us. She said it first as I responded, "That's my line. What the fuck did you do to me?" She screamed back, "I don't know what happened." I took a deep breath and said, "What do you mean you don't know?" I really have no idea what's happening to you," she said as she looked and took a half step back. Her need for food must have been bad as mine because she never stopped eating through the whole conversation. After a minute or two going back and forth, we both calmed down a bit. She had finished the chicken, but we were both still feeling hunger pains, and they were getting worse. I cleared out everything in the fridge and the freezer so we could eat while we figured this out. We didn't get very far before I had to go to the chest freezer, and I just started going to town. More than a few times, I couldn't talk because I was too busy forcing down food into my body. The same with her. Meat or vegetables, it didn't matter. It all went down until there was almost nothing left in the house. When we were finally done, there was nothing but empty cans, jars, wrappers all over the house. Now that we could think clearly, I tried to ask her a few questions. At least I tried. I stood up, and without warning, rings ripped through the skin of my back. I've never experienced pain like that, nor would I ever want to again. As I lay on the ground, I could feel as the pain and the hunger for more food. Thankfully, there was something she was expecting, and there was a large roast I had in the freezer was still placed in front of me. I didn't care that it was still half frozen. I tore into it like a starving dog. Surprisingly, the more I ate, the less my back hurt. As it turns out, I needed the calories and biomass to heal. This suddenly made her willingness to give information for food so much clearer. I stood up, no longer in pain or hungry, and took in my surroundings. It was clear that I was taller, but by how much I wouldn't know until later. The place looked like a total mess, and I was extremely tired. I mentioned this, and she told me that it was normal after her transformation, which is why she passed out so quickly after we finished. I stumbled to my bed and just about collapsed on it. With everything that had happened in the past few hours, I needed to get some sleep and figure this out with a clear head. Thankfully, I wasn't going through this alone, and she flopped onto the bed next to me. We both chuckled as stomach fluid audibly made itself known. I tried to roll on my back, but those damn wings wouldn't let me. I laid on my side, and the last thing I saw before I passed out was my date drifting off, looking at me. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the shower running. I rolled over and had to reach for the alarm clock to see what time. When I did, I received a couple of shocks. First, it was almost 3 in the afternoon. And second, my hands were back to normal. In fact, I started reaching around till most of me was back to normal. There was just a few things different, like the fact that I was still a few inches taller. Now I figured somewhere around 6'8". My body hair was still completely gone. Yes, that includes the sensitive groin area. I still didn't have much fat on me at all, and my muscles were still larger than I thought. Yes, that does include the most important one. I still freaked out and grabbed for my cell phone. I called into work and told them that I had an emergency come up, and I left without my phone. Since I am not one to call out unless I'm rapidly losing fluids, they told me not to worry about it and let me know that the next day or evening if I was all right. I hung up the phone and headed to the bathroom. Nature was calling, and it wasn't stopping for me. When I reached the bathroom, my date was still taking a shower, so I just relieved myself. I could see in my peripheral view a pair of eyes looking out at me. When I turned, all I could hear was, "Do you want to join me?" Women really need to realize not to say that to a guy while he's taking a leak. Unless you want to clean the walls, I guess. Thankfully, I got done with that before any extra sprays happened. Jokingly, I said, "You just got clean and now you want to get dirty?" Note to self. Never say suggestive things to a succubus unless you really want to follow it up. She pulled back the shower curtain and my jaw just about hit the floor. Her thin, petite body had gone through a transformation too, and it was like she had also gained a few inches in height and her curves as well. Let's just say they were more defined and filled out in all the right ways. Yeah. I turned into a cross between Charlie from 2.5 Men and Quagmire from Family Guy. This time my normal male desires had been cranked well past 10, and I wasn't going to last long at all. Slipping into the shower doesn't help things either. We ended up on the bed again. This time it was more like making love than, well, straight up fucking. When I finished, I made sure I finished in a way that would satiate her desire as a succubus as well. Which is good, because I had a lot more questions. For the first day, it was about cleaning up, restocking the house, and me asking a bunch of questions, though the biggest ones she didn't have to answer to. You see, there's no precedence that she knew of for my transformation. Though I had a theory, I didn't want to say anything. She told me about her family and her clan. No, those are not quite the same thing. Clans have multiple families in them and hold a delicate balance within their society and the other races, especially with humans. The only thing we had to go on was how other races increased their numbers, but none of them had anything to do with sex. Not to mention that my transformation seemed to be linked exclusively to a succubus. She called her mother to see if she would have anything to say about this. I made sure to tell her that she had heard a rumor going around and that she wanted to see if there was any truth to it. As it turns out, there are old legends, but not much else. I was listening to the speakerphone conversation when her mother mentioned that she was going to be flying to the States for business in a week and that we should meet for lunch. I was very willing to agree, and I planned to tag along. Maybe now I can get some frickin' answers. It just occurred to me that I never told you my date's name. I guess I tried to keep it out of the light, but screw it. Her name's Jolene, and I got to see her almost every night for the week that we were waiting. It became an odd dance of her coming over, either making a large dinner for us, or I would make one and have it waiting. Transformation or not, we burned through a lot of calories together. Most nights involve us making small talk, eating dinner, enjoying dessert, and then getting something else to chew on. Though a couple times we ended up going shopping together. You see, many times we would transform in the middle of an activity and not even realize it. Since she had claws or talons, I can't tell, I would go through a bunch of sheets and at least one full mattress. I know it sounds funny, but not so much when you have to start to dig in your reserve funds to cover all the replacements. On a couple of days that we were both off of work, she helped me to master my transformations. Thankfully, it didn't hurt nearly as much compared to the first time, and eventually it didn't hurt at all. In fact, I found that it gave me a bit of a workout high. Those that spend a lot of time in the gym know what I'm talking about. I finally got a good look at myself in the mirror, though I had to lower my head a bit to see what my full face looked like now. Now here for the total breakdown. Now you would think that I would just look like a succubus, but you would only be slightly correct. Starting from the top, I didn't actually grow horns. Instead, they're two large ridges that run down basically the size of slash top of my head instead of the horns, though they do seem to start a little farther forward than Jolene's. My neck is thick like a football player, along with the rest of me. Now, because of my high calorie burn, I can't seem to hold any weight, which is a change for me. All my muscles seem to have grown in size, which I still have a hard time figuring out the science behind it. Although, how I've seemed to grow a few inches taller, though a bit of that is due to how my legs are shaped now. Almost dog-like, but still clearly human, if that makes any sense. Now, one of the biggest differences between her form and mine is the fact that I don't have claws, neither on my hands or feet. But she sure does. I swear that woman tries to carve her name into my back every few days. Ugh. As far as the wings go, at best estimate there's about 30-foot length. I spread them all the way, but I'm guessing since we didn't have a measuring tape. Yes, I can move them, at least to a point. I can't really flap like a bird, mainly because they're attached to my mid-back and not on the sides. I can't bring them down low like birds' wings, though I can wrap them around my upper body to a point. The one part of that is just difficult to get used to the tail. What a pain in the ass, literally. Not that it hurts, but I keep hitting things with it. That reminds me I need to go buy some more drinking glasses. Now, it does come in a little handy at times. This is as long as you do remember that it's there. Though after watching Jolene, I have figured out that it's mainly for balance after the transformation. As we walk, we tend to move like a fish's tail would, well, back and forth, almost also like a snake waving in the breeze, but it doesn't ever touch the ground. Jolene told me that if a succubus lets their tail drag, it's either because they're injured, ill, or showing signs of disrespect for the person in the house. Just one of the many things I had to learn about succubus culture. Oh, one more thing is that, as it turns out, the actions of the tail can betray your emotions. Like if you're startled, a tail might go out and slightly up as you jump. A low hanging tail might tell you they're depressed. Things like that are something to look out for when you start, with a tail. And it's just as bad as also staring at a woman's chest, so don't look too long. Take a quick look and then just keep going. The day finally arrived where I would meet Jolene's mother. I have to say I was a bit nervous. Not only was this the first meeting of a parent, but also a chance to find out what I had become. On top of that, she was the head of the family, which put her on the council. The council being those who decide matters within the clan. Think of it as their version of a senate, I guess. When we reached the hotel, I noticed that it was very high end, also in the richer part of the city, and all I could do was think that those monster movies where they save a tremendous amount of wealth over the course of centuries. That sort of thing, right? You see, they still make money, just in a more traditional ways, mainly through real estate. After getting off the elevator, we walked to a couple of security guards that Jolene seemed to know. They exchanged small pleasantries, and we were escorted into the most lavish hotel suite I have ever seen. There was a bar, multiple rooms, a closed double door that I correctly assumed was the bedroom. Jolene and I walked in, and security stayed outside the doors. I was getting a little nervous as I began to look around for something to jump out from behind the couch. Then I heard a toilet flush. Out came two stunning women in very expensive clothes. By expensive, I mean impractical and thin. Really thin. I was trying to keep my composure as the first one spotted me and stopped dead in her stride. Just then Jolene ran over and gave them a big hug. She called them over and introduced me to her sisters, or I should say half-sisters. I forgot to mention that succubus can get pregnant, but it's rare, so they usually have multiple partners. Usually it is from the last push from their sexual partner before collapsing from cardiac arrest. Jolene introduced her sisters. There's Selena and Roxanne. They both look similar and very, very attractive. The only real difference between the two was that Selena had jet black hair and slightly pale skin and was about an inch taller than her two sisters. Roxanne was the same height as Jolene and had a more blonde with red-ish hint in her hair. I'm sure there's a word for that, but I don't know. Both of them were filled out in all the right places, and the way they were dressed left very little to the imagination. While introducing myself to them, I was finding it difficult to maintain my composure. Whatever had been done to me had turned everything up to past 10 and into 20, and had made it difficult not to show it. Thankfully, Jolene noticed and said, "How about you get a drink?" "Good idea," I told her. As I went behind the bar, I could only find a few bottles and no mixers, so not really my thing. I decided to just have a scotch on the rocks. As I poured the glass, the doors from the bedroom opened and an elegant woman walked out. Her hair was done up just perfect, and the way she walked just had an air of elegance in the way that I have trouble truly explaining. She then spoke, "Girls, make sure you're ready. Your sister will be here any moment now." Jolene spoke up, "You always did know how to make an entrance, Mother." And with that, she sent from elegant actress to doting mother. They just ran and hugged each other as though they hadn't seen each other in years. Well, turns out I was right. Almost a decade, in fact. Jolene had told me that she wanted to see the world, so she traveled a lot. It never occurred to me to ask her how long she'd been traveling. I was just there watching for a few minutes before Jolene introduced me to her mother. I walked over and she held out her hand like a debutante wanted me to kiss her rings or something. I took her hand like a normal person you would nowadays and said, "Ma'am, it's good to meet you." She seemed a bit put back by my actions, though not in any disrespectful way. It was just not what she was used to. Jolene's mother had introduced herself as Constantia, or Constancia, I have a problem pronouncing that, and head of the family. The way she spoke had an arrogance about it which really got under my skin. So it was difficult not to just say, "Hi, I'm the guy banging your daughter." Instead, I just politely introduced myself and we all sat down. That is, after I grabbed my drink, and made Selena one as well. As I sat down, the girls began to catch up with each other about what happened on their time apart. Constancia had been busy. As head of the family, she was constantly busy with the other clans. It seems as though there's always tension somewhere with all the different clans contesting territory or pushing their dominance over another. Thankfully, the Succubus clan is not one to get in disputes like that. This makes them best suited to mediate any disputes between clans. It seems as though the vampires and werewolves are still at each other's throats. They all rolled their eyes as though this had been such a common annoyance that it was really not worth mentioning. The Freys, what we know as fairies, have adjusted their territories along with the ogres and trolls. This has caused some disputes that they had to be settled before any bloodshed. It also seems as though humans have been pushing deeper and deeper into the clan territories and getting scared off, or sometimes worse. Since the Russian government has been in good standings with the Yetis, that portion of the map is very quiet, though they can't say that about the Squatch in the west. It seems they've been getting more brazen as times have gone on. Although it was interesting, it wasn't what I came here to talk about. Selena had been spending a lot of time in Europe. She had been a bit of a minx, going to all the social events and rubbing elbows, along with other things, with some of the most influential, and by that way I mean wealthy, people of the world. Due to this, she gained more money and influence than many countries around the world. Roxanne had spent most of her time in the pop culture elites in the West. Though her mother had forbade her from being the leading lady in films, if you look closely, you would see her in the background of some of the biggest movies ever made. As it turns out, her beauty and stage presence forces many scenes to be cut from some of the biggest movies ever made. This was so that she would not upstage the main characters of the film. They did joke about how she would make a complete killing in the porn industry, but having to hide your face for a century after performing for a decade or two was just not worth it in the long run. The three of them talked for over 2 hours, even taking time for lunch, and I just sat there sipping my drink. In fact, I had more than one. Hell, I had got up to pretend to freshen up my drink just so I could move around and not fall asleep in front of them. It wasn't until after lunch that I finally got down to business. "So," Constantia said, looking at me, "how did you two end up being so close?" I could tell she was waiting for me to give her a reaction. I just stayed stoic, and she continued, "Also, what clan are you from?" Jolene looked at me with concern on her face. There must have been something in her tone I wasn't picking up on. I answered with, "I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't belong to any clan." The ladies looked puzzled for a moment. Then Constantia got a serious look on her face. "Are you a hunter, then?" she asked me. Jolene jumped in and proclaimed, "No, he's not, or we wouldn't even be having this conversation." This seemed to calm the ladies down a bit. I just turned to Jolene and whispered into her ear, "Hunter?" She softly answered, "I'll explain later." Constantia continued with, "If you're not in a clan and you're not a hunter, then I guess you're here as a dessert tray?" She began to inch forward as though she was getting ready to pounce. The other two also began to move into position and also had the creepiest grins I had ever seen. I began to reach behind my back for my pistol when Jolene stepped in and just said, "Wrong again." She jumped up and stood between us, loudly saying, "Wait, remember when I asked you about the incubus, how it might be created instead of born?" The two girls looked confused. Constantia suddenly turned very serious. Then she asked, "You mean he is one?" Jolene nodded. The three of them looked at each other for a moment and then burst out laughing. Not just a life laugh by any means, but full-on, gut-busting roar of a laugh. At one point, they weren't even making noises. Were holding their sides. After a minute of this, Jolene just turned to me and simply said, "Show them." I unbuckled my belt, since it would be the only article of clothing that wouldn't give way under the pressure of my transformation. I had a small dose of anxiety about transforming in front of a crowd, but then Jolene placed my hand on her breast, and we were off to the races for sure. The full transformation takes about 30 seconds to a minute to complete. That is, unless you're under a boatload of stimulation. Then it can only take a couple of seconds to complete. FYI, the faster the transformation, the more food is required afterwards. Once I finished, I ripped the torn pieces of fabric off my body and stood almost defiant over the no longer laughing trio of females. They looked me up and down with total disbelief. I had to break the silence by motioning my hand, saying, "Hey, my eyes are up here." It took a few more seconds to realize that Jolene had transformed as well and was standing right next to me. Saying it was difficult at that point to keep myself under control is being nice. Constantia stood up and began to poke at my chest and arm as though she was making sure it was real and not some hallucination. At that point, she was nothing but serious. She began to go on a long rant, saying how this was unprecedented and that we could not tell anyone about this. We had already figured this, since the balance between the clans is always tenuous at best. Though the amount of time she mentioned this was enough to make me believe there were things going on that she was not mentioning. I began to listen very closely for anything she might give away as why she was being so cautious, though nothing really came up that told me anything. She made an appointment with a few doctors she trusted to figure out how this was even possible, though I did have to go to their office to get the blood work or everything else done. I had to return to my human form and get some food in me before I could leave. Constantia had to order me some new clothes as well, since everything was in tatters. With the time we had to get clothing and food, I turned to Constantia and said, "We need to borrow your room in the meantime." I was kind of at my limit on keeping everything under control, and it was getting obvious. When Jolene and I walked to the bedroom, she immediately spun around and said, "This is a private party." When I turned around, I could see that Selena and Roxanne had followed us to the room. They had already begun to remove what little clothing they had and drop it on the ground as they walked up. They both had absolutely rocking bodies, which made it almost impossible to keep from taking all three of them right there on the floor. After a few seconds of looking at them, Jolene got a strange sensation behind her, telling her to close the door quickly. We didn't even make it to the bed at first. Hell, you could say that we barricaded the door at that point. Not sure, but I could have sworn that they were both still on the other side of the door. 2 hours later, we emerged from the bedroom, fully back to our original forms. We were greeted by smiling faces, fresh clothes, and cold food. Didn't mind much, since we were both so hungry. The suit fit surprisingly well for not getting my measurements, though I still refused to wear a tie. The girls giggled, as girls do when one screams so loud with pleasure you'd think she's going to shatter glass. We ate, finished getting dressed, and got to the address of the clinic we had to go. We said our goodbyes and took our long walk several blocks down to the clinic. It was a well-stocked location. They had everything we needed for samples of fluid, hair, and such. There was even an x-ray machine, CAT scan, MRI, all sorts of things. Though, when they said they were going to biopsy my organs, I told them to go straight to hell. Talking with the doctors, they told me that the only reason why I didn't pass out during the transformation or eat my own body weight in food is due to the fact that my body simply condenses the biomass. So my bones, muscles, tendons, nerves, and everything else condenses to account for the change in size. Though it seems that due to the change in size, it can only condense me so much before it gets dangerous. This is the reason why I reside now at 77 inches, 6 feet 5 inches, instead of 6 feet even. Once they got the results and I got some answers, Jolene and I left to go back home. On the way down the elevator, a couple of guys on 2 floors down. They looked at Jolene and then to me. It was clear that they already had a few drinks in them into their night before they even spoke. The first guy asked, "So, how much for the rental?" The other guy backhanded the first guy's shoulder in an attempt to reprimand him. Jolene looked a little confused and then mad as she realized what was going on. I simply held her close and replied, "She's not a rental. She's my girlfriend." Both guys looked at her, then looked at me, then back to her, and the second guy simply said, "Dude," and then held up his hand for a fist bump. The first guy then did the same. The doors opened and gave a fist bump to both of them as we stepped off the elevator. I'm guessing it was because of what I said, but Jolene was holding tight on my arm and had a huge smile on her face as we stepped out into the night. These are the moments we need to enjoy. You never know what's coming down the road next.